Doctor Who Series 13 is seemingly set to bring back a few returning villains, those being the Sontarans and the Weeping Angels, due to the fact that we've seen both of them filming in set photos. But is that it for the returning monsters? I sincerely hope not. The returning monsters are one of my favourite parts of the show. Who can be the Doctor without fighting the Daleks, the Cybermen, even the Master? If I was the showrunner, I would probably have a series of just full-on just returning villains. No new things, just the returning villains. I love returning villains so much, so this is why Series 13 should be all returning villains. Throughout Series 11, a common criticism I would see, and one that I would wholeheartedly agree with, is that the new villains that were created for the series felt a bit uninspired and were particularly weak. They didn't do much to serve the plot, and they weren't particularly memorable either. Now, of course, your new villains not being very good isn't necessarily a huge issue. However, Series 11 had no returning villains, so the entire series was just new villains. So you can see it starts to be a problem if your new villains aren't particularly good. It was only in the New Year's special for 2019, Resolution, where we finally got our first returning villain in the series, in the form of the Daleks. And Resolution in particular was heavily praised for having a really good portrayal of the Daleks, so it showed Chibnall could write good villains, and the best villain he'd written so far was a returning one. So fast forward to 2020, we get Spyfall Part 1 with the epic reveal of the Master, and then Spyfall Part 2 shows off this new Master, and again it's another great portrayal of a classic villain. And then obviously in episode 5 you had the Judoon, who are used really effectively, and then the Haunting of Villa Diodati, the Cybermen are again portrayed really well, showing that yet another returning classic villain is being portrayed perfectly. This series had a few standout new villains. The Kasavina ones I absolutely love. I thought they were really good, and I quite liked the Skithra as well, but the rest of the new villains were created were a bit weak. This once again showed that Chris Chibnall's new villains seemed to be on the whole pretty weak, but his returning villain portrayals were pretty excellent. And assuming that continues into Series 13, you can see why I would want just a series of returning villains. It's been shown from the past few series that Chris Chibnall writes returning villains particularly well, whereas his new villains don't seem to be as well written or portrayed. So it makes story and logical sense if in Series 13 we just had a whole series of returning villains, because they're written so well. Now obviously having new villains, new characters and things is not bad at all. I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's not bad to have new villains. So I'm not saying that the returning villains should be the main antagonists for every episode, but they should have a presence in every episode. For example, you could have an episode with the Judoon in, but the Judoon aren't the main villains. That's a completely new species of alien. But the Judoon work, say, with the Doctor to stop them, so you have that returning presence in the story.
Or still retaining a new fun idea. I guess there could also be budget reasons for just having a whole series of returning villains. It means they probably don't need to develop any new prosthetics. And most of the costumes and props and things associated with those returning villains are probably just there in BBC Studios ready to just be used on a day. This would mean that they'd have more money to develop things like the set design and the special effects for the episodes. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Series 11 was completely full of new villains, which I wasn't particularly a fan of. This also means that on the whole, Jodie Whittaker hasn't really met as many returning villains as all the other Doctors. So I feel like it'd be great if in her final series she just meets loads and loads to balance it out a bit. Also, if you had a whole series of just returning villains, you'd have to be more inventive with your villain roster. The past few years in Doctor Who, it's sort of been you get your Daleks, your Cybermen, the Master, and then maybe occasionally just the one random returning villain. But if you had the whole series as returning villains, then you'll be forced to be more creative with which ones you brought back. For example, I'd like to see some of the ones which were just initially Monster of the Weeks just return, like the Reapers, or the Boneless would also be a great one. But yeah, with a full series of returning villains, then that would make you have to bring back some of these ones that we haven't seen for a long time. And even bring back some ones from the classic series who are yet to be seen in the new series. But I want to hear what you think. Tell me what you think down in the comment section below. Do you think Series 13 should be all returning villains? Do you think Series 13 should be not all returning villains? If you do, which returning villains would you like to see in the series? Whatever you think, remember to like and subscribe. But in the meantime, I've been Cyberman Alpha, and from me for now, it's goodbye.